Okay, in this lecture I'm going to be talking about biogeography. As you can probably tell from the name, bio comes from the Greek word bios, meaning life, and geography obviously studies the spatial distribution of Earth's physical phenomena. So when we say biogeography, we're really just talking about how Earth's plants, animals, and other species of life are distributed over geographic space. Okay, now I'm not from Southern California, but I've come to know some of the plants and animals here that occur here naturally. How many of these can you name? I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, so we have all native species that can occur here endemically. The top left large tree is going to be a sycamore, occurring in lots of ravines. The California bulrush is to the right of that. That's the green grass with the brown tufts on top. That can actually be made into reeds to create boats, and it grows all over the Pacific coast, including all the way down to Peru, where those boats are made using the same plant. Next to that is the desert 5-point, a beautiful star-shaped flower. You can find these in Death Valley. In the middle is, of course, the California poppy. On the bottom left, this is actually an invasive Mediterranean mustard plant that grows all over the California hillsides, especially in Southern California. And on the bottom right, that's another native species. That is the nopal cactus or prickly pear cactus. Also edible, just like the mustard plant, which is invasive. The only invasive one on this slide. Okay, so by the end of this lecture, you should be able to point to any random spot on your globe or on your map and have some rough idea of what types of plants and animals will occur there, or if you'll see a lack of a great variety of plants and animals. You have to obviously know different concepts like climate basics, continentality, or as well as the rain shadow effect, whether places are really rainy or really dry places, or conversely, if they're always rainy or rainy in certain times of the year. So these are all different things that you have to take into account. And on the bottom right there, you can see a friendly little bat that's just completely covered in pollen, and that's really to show you that everything is connected. We know that bees are not our only pollinators that pollinate food that humans eat, but so are bats, small flies, butterflies, and moths. Everything is connected, right? So how does geography affect plant and animal distribution across the globe? We're going to be building on those concepts that I mentioned, which is the rain shadow effect. So this is, in short, also called the orographic uplift effect. This is basically that rain tends to occur on one side of a mountain chain. You can see this all over the world. We'll get into that later and discuss which side it occurs on. Continentality refers to how far inland something is. So coastal environments, that is, areas where the land meets the water, ocean bodies meet large masses of land, that will affect the climate of the area. And continentality refers to inland or continental locations that are far from any coasts. Temperature, latitude, high pressure, low pressure, obviously these deal in climate, and then soil is kind of a related topic. Of course, that's just the land, the terrain itself. What is its composition? Because we know places like deserts, as a result of them being so dry, they have very high sand percentages in the soil there. So they don't tend to grow a great variety of plants as compared to what you can see in this picture, which would be the rainforest on top, which has plants growing out of plants, which are called epiphytes. Okay, so let's get into it. As I said, the rain shadow effect. So this is basically telling us that a parcel of air, when it gets pushed into a mountain chain, that parcel of air can only go up, right? It can't go through the mountain. That's not how air works. So when wind pushes a parcel of air, a big bunch of air, moves over a mountain, as it rises, it drops in temperature. And air can only hold so much moisture as it gets colder, right? When the air gets colder and colder, it releases that moisture. Okay, and then when it releases that moisture, that's what we see as precipitation on the windy side of a mountain chain, or the windward side of a mountain chain. So all of the areas where you see great green patches on one side of a mountain and then a dry desert or a more semi-arid area on the other side, you're basically seeing which way the wind is carrying precipitation. Okay, so continentality, as I mentioned, how far inland something is. So a place like Kansas, which is very far from hundreds of miles away from the coast, it's going to have a different climate, different biogeographic features than a place like Maine or Alaska or Florida or California, all places where there's a long coastal area. And one general rule is that coastal areas, because they're sitting next to large bodies of water, their climates tend to be relatively moderated by that body of water, which is to say that oceans absorb a lot of solar radiation. A lot of solar energy or heat is absorbed by the oceans, and that causes the coastal areas around those oceans to have more moderated temperatures, less extremes. So less extreme cold and less extreme heat will be found on coastal areas in general. Now, of course, that doesn't apply to polar regions like Antarctica, Greenland, of course. Those are very, very far north and very, very far south at the edge of the hemisphere. So they're not receiving that much solar radiation to begin with. That's why those places don't really have the continentality effect as much. Okay, now speaking of continentality, this is a global map that's an overview of different biomes that you can find throughout the world. Now, what you might notice right away, sort of if you're looking at the top, is that there's this tundra, this purple color. We'll get to that later, but it's important to note that in a place you'll see tundra, so for example, Baffin Island or northern parts of Canada, a lot of these are very coastal places, and they're going to experience a tundra climate. Whereas if you go sort of more inland, you'll see the bright green, which is the boreal forest. So it's at the same latitude, experiencing similar levels of solar radiation because it's at that same latitude, that same bar of the Earth. But a place that has a boreal forest is much more inland, so much more of a continental location. And therefore, its temperatures are going to experience greater extremes because they're not being regulated by the big body of water that absorbs so much solar radiation. So that's why you'll see coastal areas are going to experience their own type of biome. Another coastal biome that's typically associated with the west coast of continents is the Mediterranean climate zone. It's also, called the chaparral on this map, and it's represented in sort of a dark brown color. So you'll see that in Southern California, in Western South America, like Chile, in Southwest Australia, and in Southwest Africa. Obviously, it's named for the Mediterranean region, so places like Italy, Greece, France, and Spain will experience this climate. So it's pretty warm and dry throughout most of the year, but it will have a wet winter. And it doesn't usually drop that cold, probably around 45 degrees or 40 degrees Fahrenheit at the absolute coldest in the winter. The other thing that it's important to note here is that on the eastern side of continents, you're going to be seeing temperate forest, a deciduous forest. So in the eastern, pretty much east of the Mississippi in North America, that's going to be experiencing that deciduous forest, much of Russia and Europe, as well as most of Eurasia and China, Japan. So this is a forest that's associated with 4 different seasons. The other big pink bars that you're going to be noticing here as deserts, these are going to occur at the 30 degrees north, roughly, and 30 degrees south latitudes. And we'll talk about why that is, why deserts tend to occur there going forward. So I'm basically going to be starting at 0 at the equator, this imaginary line that cuts through the so-called middle of the Earth, dividing it into 2 equal semi-spheres or hemispheres. So let's start at 0. The world's tropical rainforests mostly occur here because This is that band around the sort of center of the Earth that is constantly receiving a heavy, strong amount of solar radiation. So it's constantly being heated. The oceans around that area are constantly being heated, and as I said earlier, warm oceans, warm air tends to be associated with very moist air. These places, it will rain almost every single day. In fact, I have a friend from this southern part of Brazil. The city he's from, he said it rains every single day. A lot of people from places like Singapore, the Philippines, they're familiar with that. Because of this high amount of precipitation and very warm conditions, this may be where human life originated. We don't know for sure, but we do know for sure that these are very biodiverse regions. So it's found roughly between the areas of 0 to 10 degrees north or south. Okay, so we're moving farther north as well as south of the equator at 0 degrees, around 5 to 20 degrees north and south of the equator. You might think of this as a tropical area, but strictly speaking, this is a tropical seasonal forest. And what that means is basically there's only one season where it's wet and rainy, usually in the summer. An example of Mexico, where I do my research, it's going to be wet in most of the country during the winter months like October, November, December, and then it'll be a little bit drier in the summer. These places can be found in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, large portions of the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and most of Brazil. Okay, and now that brings us to the tropical savanna. These have a little bit of a broad range. You're going to see them throughout most of Eastern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, so places as far west as Nigeria and Mali, and then as far east as Kenya, Tanzania. These are what you associate with sort of iconic species like the zebra, the giraffe, elephant, lion, African lion. These are places where it's pretty dry throughout most of the year. The soil quality is not that great. That's why you're going to see a lot of grasslands, not a lot of trees here. This is a place that, like Mediterranean climate, it's going to have a wet season and a dry season. Okay, now this is the one biome that has the most dramatic effect from its climate. And of course, I'm talking about the desert. Now, what you want to pay attention to here is that at 30 degrees north of the equator and 30 degrees south of the equator, there is a high pressure band, an atmospheric pressure band that's an area at the end of a Hadley cell where not a lot of moist air can penetrate that hot high pressure area. So because of that, rainfall precipitation is very, very low here. Obviously, deserts are dry areas. Other things that you'll note is that these are often places where they are on the leeward side of a mountain chain. So we talked about the rain shadow effect, how the windy side of a mountain will have much higher rates of precipitation, be much wetter than the leeward side after that parcel of air keeps moving and it brings back down dry, high pressure air. That's another reason will you see deserts where you see them. So we can see around the 30 degrees north band, there is of course, the Death Valley in the United States and California, the Mojave Desert, the Sonora Desert, and then moving further east, you'll see the massive Sahara Desert, the Arabian Desert. There are several deserts in inland China. As well as in the southern hemisphere, we have the Atacama Desert, which stretches from Peru all the way through most of Chile. And then parts of Australia, and in the southern Africa, we'll see the Namib Desert. So these are places where the atmosphere doesn't bring a lot of rain. Sometimes it might bring almost no rain at all. And it will be very hot there throughout most of the year. One way that water can be supplied will be through groundwater. So you'll see maybe a spring or an elevated part of the water table where you can dig just a few feet down and there'll be a source of water. So that's where you might see an oasis or oases, which is how you say oasis, plural. All right, now moving further and further away from the equator, we have arrived at the Mediterranean climate. So where I am now in Southern California is experiencing this climate, or this biome. This is a place that's dry throughout most of the year, warm and very clear skies because it's also a high pressure area, just like the desert was. The only difference between Mediterranean and the desert, or one of the main differences I should say, is that it will have a wet winter. Now obviously we said it's named after the Mediterranean basin, but it also occurs in different parts of the world. Other features of the Mediterranean climate will be usually a fairly decent soil. Plants will tend to be short here, so you'll see a lot of shrubs like sagebrush, chaparral. And the reason that they're so short and sort of scrub-like is because they have a deep underground network of roots to get water underground because they're not getting a lot of rain throughout the year. However, that said, you will see larger trees like sycamore along rivers where there is water flowing throughout the year. But in general, these are very pleasant places to live because they have very moderate temperatures throughout the year, and humans can grow almost any kind of crop that they want to here. And because they're on all these different continents, you'll see similar species of animal life, but there's not a lot of overlap because those places were never really close to each other and the animals differ quite a bit. Okay, now we said that the Mediterranean climate will be occurring typically on the western coast of continents. This one, conversely, the mid-latitude grassland, might appear at a similar latitude, however, it's not going to be on the coast. The mid-latitude grasslands are very much associated with continental interiors, so that is to say, far away from most oceans. They have a very flat topography and very good soils. Because of that, they have been mostly heavily converted to agricultural lands. And of course, the breadbasket of America, as well as a huge tract of Eurasia like Mongolia, Ukraine. These are areas that are grasslands. They have a flat topography. Not a lot of trees will grow there because the wind can be very strong throughout most of the year, especially because it's just gently rolling hills. So there's quite a bit of wind there. The other sort of climactic phenomenon we need to mention is wildfires. So mid-latitude grasslands, as well as Mediterranean climates, and to some degree deserts, all experience naturally occurring wildfires because they're dry throughout part of the year. And those are almost always started by lightning strikes. And of course, humans can start wildfires too. So these are all things to keep into account as we look at these different biomes. Okay, now we've come to the mid-latitude forest. Now these are almost always going to be seen on the eastern side of continents, which is why you'll see them throughout most of eastern North America, as well as East Asia, so places like Japan, Korea, most of China. You'll also see some down there in Australia. Now what we normally find here is 4 distinct seasons, which is to say that a lot of the trees, the deciduous trees, will go through very beautiful dramatic changes throughout the year where they're green, getting a lot of water in the summer and it's warm. Then fall comes, the leaves change their color, and then in the winter they lose all their leaves and they might look dead. But really they're just dormant in the winter and they'll come back in the spring when it starts to get warm again. So mid-latitude forests experience 4 distinctive seasons. And there are also a lot of iconic animal species you can find here, such as bear, wolves, foxes, skunks, porcupines, things like that. Now you might also picture a bear or a wolf in our next biome, the boreal forest. You can also imagine animals like a moose or an elk. Different species like that are very prevalent here. A boreal forest is somewhat similar to the mid-latitude forest. However, it occurs at a higher latitude on the Earth. It does not occur in the southern hemisphere, and it is a little bit drier, or sometimes a great bit drier than the mid-latitude forest. And so its soil quality is not nearly as good as a mid-latitude forest. The other thing to note with boreal forests is that it's going to tend to be an inland, more continental forest. That said, it does occur in many different countries with a lot of coastline, like Norway, Russia, and Canada. Okay, and that brings us to our last major biome, which is the tundra. People sometimes call tundras cold deserts, and the reason that people call them that is because tundras receive very little rainfall, very little snow, and almost no precipitation throughout the year. So because they're so dry, they do not have very good soil. There's not a great variety of plants that will grow here, besides an occasional moss, lichen, some different types of seaweed, and then some berry bushes and scrub that might grow in the summer. Migratory species like caribou are quite iconic here, so places like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northern Alaska. The other main thing to note here is that these are coastal. So whereas at the roughly 70 degrees north latitude inland, you're going to see a boreal forest with spruce, fir, pine trees. Out at the coast, at that same latitude, roughly 70 degrees, you're going to see a tundra climate, which is cold, may experience glaciers, icebergs, and it's going to have a lot of sunlight throughout the summer and almost total darkness throughout the winter. So I'm going to explain that in another lecture, why the top of the Earth and the bottom of the Earth, if you want to call it that, the North Pole and the South Pole, why are those places going to receive basically 6 months of winter and 6 months of darkness, and then conversely in the summer they'll be bright all year round. We'll talk about that in another lecture. Okay, and our last major biome type is the highlands. Highlands are sort of the wild card, the X factor, if you will. And I say that because they do not follow the typical rules of latitude being the main determinant of climate and biome. So, highlands can occur anywhere on the Earth where you have an elevated, very high up mountain chain. So in a place like Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, there are occasional highland climates. And that's pretty miraculous when you have a hot tropical country down low, and then if you go higher up, you'll see a much colder area. So because they're so high up, there's not a lot of warmth there. There's not a lot of great soil there, and therefore there's almost no tree species are associated with highlands. You may see some grass in places like Machu Picchu. But in general, the climate can be pretty capricious here. It can change from minute to minute, hour to hour. And they can occur anywhere on Earth. And that about does it for our biogeography lecture. Now, these are just the major biomes that you'll find throughout most of the world. There are different climate classification systems, and some people might include more biome types. There are also microclimates and places called ecotones, and that's where different biomes meet up against each other and experience many different unique features and biodiversity. So just remember that the way to determine a biogeography is to look at the latitude relative to the equator, the location, whether it's continental, inland, or coastal, close to an ocean, and lastly, its elevation, if it's high or low, up in the mountains or close to the sea. Thanks for listening.